I learned that love doesn't always protect you from betrayal. I thought my son Damien would grieve with me when my husband Arthur passed. Instead, the moment the estate lawyer announced a $40 million inheritance, Damien's compassion vanished. His wife, Serena, smirked as if she had won a prize. In the same breath, he ordered me to pack my belongings and prepared paperwork to place me in a nursing home. I was shocked, humiliated. But what neither of them knew was that Arthur had hidden a clause in the will. When that clause came to light, everything changed. And soon, the woman who cheered my exile was on her knees, begging me for help. My name is Beatrice Hale, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I would be standing beside my husband's casket, feeling both grief and dread. Arthur had been my partner since I was 27. We built a life from nothing, late-night shifts, shared ambitions, and whispered dreams. At the funeral, my son Damien squeezed my hand, promising to take care of everything. I believed him. I wanted to. Murmurs of relatives, the scent of lilies, and the cold marble beneath my hands blurred into a haze as I tried to steady myself. I didn't notice the calculating look in Serena's eyes or the way Damien's posture shifted as the estate lawyer approached. The betrayal began quietly, like a storm forming on a distant horizon. The moment we stepped into the lawyer's office, the atmosphere changed. She could feel tension radiating from Damien as he impatiently tapped his fingers on the polished mahogany table. The will was read slowly, every clause, condition, and signature explained in detail. When Arthur's $40 million estate was formally transferred to Damien, a chilling silence followed. She expected at least a moment of reflection, perhaps gratitude, but instead, Serena's lips curled into a subtle smirk. In that instant, grief was eclipsed by a cold realization. They weren't mourning a husband or father, they were celebrating an inheritance. The shock numbed her, making her question whether decades of sacrifice meant anything. The office, once a place of trust, now felt like the birthplace of betrayal. After the reading, Damien's demeanor shifted dramatically. She watched his shoulders square and chin lift as though wealth granted him superiority. He spoke to her not with empathy, but with impatience, correcting her tone, questioning her decisions, and belittling her abilities. When she hesitated over signing routine paperwork, he sighed loudly, as if she were a burden rather than a mother. Gone was the son who once cried over scraped knees and asked for bedtime stories. In his place stood a man hardened by greed. She tried to remind herself this was grief speaking, that emotions were raw. But beneath his clipped words and dismissive gestures, she sensed something darker, an entitlement that would soon grow into cruelty. Serena didn't pretend. She openly flaunted her excitement, making calls about renovations, shopping sprees, and vacation plans. She spoke of their newfound status, hinting at parties and social circles she longed to impress. She scrutinized family heirlooms, calculating their worth instead of their sentiment. When she thought no one was listening, she mocked the outdated decor and scoffed at old-fashioned traditions. She saw the estate not as a legacy, but as a trophy. The coldness in her voice was unmistakable, and it stung deeply. She realized Serena didn't just tolerate her, she resented her presence. And with Damien's newfound power, the path was being paved for her removal, step by subtle step. It began casually, with a comment disguised as concern. Damien suggested she sell the house and downsize to something more manageable. When she declined, he grew firmer, arguing financial practicality and her age as reasons. Serena chimed in, insisting she couldn't possibly maintain such a large property. The conversation escalated into a thinly veiled ultimatum. She could leave willingly or face a legal removal. Hearing such words from her own child struck like a blow. She tried to remind him of memories, birthdays, holidays, Arthur's laughter echoing in these halls, but nostalgia had no value in their world. For Damien and Serena, the estate was an asset, and she was merely an obstacle to be cleared. When persuasion failed, coercion began. Damien scheduled tour at nursing homes without her consent, presenting glossy brochures as if offering luxury. Serena rehearsed arguments about safety, comfort, and medical care, but their intentions were transparent. She recognized it wasn't a concern, it was convenient. The decision was made behind closed doors, and she discovered it through paperwork thrust before her. A lifetime of sacrifice was disregarded with a signature. Tears didn't sway them, pleas fell on deaf ears. In their eyes, she was no longer family, she was a liability. Surrounded by familiar walls that now felt foreign, she understood she was being strategically pushed out of her own life. The night before the forced move, she sat alone in the living room, tracing the worn armrests Arthur once leaned on. The house was quiet, but memories roared in her mind, wedding photos, children's laughter, holiday feasts. She felt invisible, discarded, and utterly powerless. The betrayal shattered her spirit, leaving a hollow ache that words couldn't express. She didn't argue, didn't fight, not because she agreed, but because she was exhausted. Numbness swallowed her. She realized the people she loved most were willing to break her for wealth. And as she prepared to leave the home she built, she whispered a silent goodbye, believing she had lost everything, unaware that a hidden clause would turn the tide. The moment Beatrice was no longer in the house, Damien and Serena wasted no time celebrating their victory. They hosted a lavish dinner with catered meals, expensive champagne, and a guest list of people eager to associate with newfound wealth. She wasn't invited, of course. She heard about it later through neighbors who called in disbelief. Damien raised toasts to new beginnings, while Serena bragged about upcoming renovations and lavish purchases. The laughter, music, and clinking glasses echoed through the estate she once nurtured. To them, $40 million wasn't a blessing, it was ammunition. Each cheer felt like another cut, proving their love had vanished the moment money arrived. The estate quickly transformed into a kingdom Damien believed he ruled. Contractors arrived daily, tearing down walls, replacing furniture, erasing decades of memories. Serena discarded family photographs, replacing them with staged portraits that reflected their newfound arrogance. They imposed strict access rules, barring relatives who questioned their decisions. Staff members loyal to Beatrice were fired, replaced with people who catered to Serena's vanity. The home's heart, once warm with tradition, ceased to exist. Damien convinced himself he earned everything, conveniently forgetting the sacrifices that built it. He believed wealth validated his authority. Yet beneath the surface of renovations and luxury, cracks of carelessness began to form, financial, emotional, and legal. Damien made the removal official. He changed the locks, rerouted mail, and informed local authorities that Beatrice no longer resided there. Her personal belongings were boxed without care and dumped at the nursing home lobby. She ran her hands across the rough cardboard, recognizing fragments of her life, wedding china, old journals, photos. The humiliation was suffocating. Nurses looked away politely, sensing her heartbreak. Damien justified his actions publicly, telling anyone who questioned him that it was best for her. The lie spread easily. She didn't argue, she simply carried the weight of betrayal silently. It was clear she was being erased from her own history. Heirlooms weren't spared. Damien and Serena contacted auctioneers, valuing items not by sentiment but profit. Arthur's vintage watch collection, Beatrice's mother's jewelry, even childhood artwork, everything became merchandise. When neighbors raised concerns, Serena labeled Beatrice a hoarder who didn't appreciate luxury. Each item sold widened the emotional chasm. She felt pieces of her family identity slipping away, auctioned to strangers who didn't know the stories behind them. Watching newspapers advertise her treasures was like witnessing her life dismantled in public view. The estate that once echoed with laughter became a showroom of greed. And with every sale, Damien walked further from humanity. The humiliation became public when Damien boasted openly about rescuing his elderly mother by placing her in a nursing home. He framed himself as selfless, painting Beatrice as incapable and dependent. His narrative spread, earning sympathy he didn't deserve. Serena dramatized the sacrifice, crying crocodile tears about the burden they carried. People believed them. Beatrice lost friends who assumed she was unstable or demanding. She watched her reputation crumble while sitting alone in a common room surrounded by strangers. The betrayal wasn't just private, it was broadcast. And yet she endured, hoping for a truth she couldn't yet see. Their arrogance would expose them, days blurred in the nursing home. She followed routines, meals, medication, check-ins, yet felt invisible. Other residents shared stories of families visiting, birthdays remembered, grandchildren hugging them. She had none of that. Damien and Serena never called, never visited, never checked on her well-being. Isolation gnawed at her spirit. The walls felt like a prison decorated with pastel art and forced smiles, but in the quiet she found clarity. She replayed memories, decisions, sacrifices, searching where she went wrong. And slowly, grief turned into resolve. She realized she had been discarded, not because she was incapable, but because wealth corrupted the son she once adored. Weeks later, a familiar face arrived, the estate lawyer, Mr. Aldridge. He scheduled a private conversation, lowering his voice to avoid eavesdroppers. He asked if she remembered Arthur discussing Clause 7, an unfamiliar term to her. She frowned, confused. Mr. Aldridge explained he couldn't reveal details yet, but urged her not to lose hope. He hinted the inheritance wasn't as absolute as Damien believed. The statement sparked something inside her, a flicker of curiosity. Was there a safeguard? A condition? For the first time since the betrayal, she felt a shift. If Arthur anticipated greed, perhaps he built a trap, one that might unravel everything. The revelation came unexpectedly. When Damien requested additional funds to pay contractors, the bank halted the transfer. Confused and irritated, he stormed into Mr. Aldridge's office demanding answers. The lawyer calmly presented the original will, directing him to Clause 7. Damien skimmed it impatiently until the words hit him. The estate and funds were conditional, valid only if he provided housing and care for Beatrice until her passing. Failure to do so triggered a reversion clause, transferring control to a trustee chosen by Arthur. Damien's face drained of color. Serena scoffed, dismissing it as outdated, but the lawyer emphasized its legal weight. For the first time, Damien realized his actions had consequences. What he believed was secure wealth suddenly became a ticking clock. Ignoring the warning, Damien continued spending recklessly. Renovation costs doubled, credit card bills piled up, and luxury purchases became routine: designer clothes, cars, high-end vacations. Serena encouraged the lifestyle, hosting extravagant gatherings to show off their wealth. Soon, they needed loans to maintain appearances. Creditors began calling, and late payment notices stacked high. Contractors halted work until payments were guaranteed. Damien reassured Serena everything was manageable, but anxiety gnawed at him. The estate, once symbolizing security, now felt like a financial trap. If Clause 7 invalidated his inheritance, he wouldn't just lose property, he'd inherit debt instead. Yet pride blinded him, and denial became his only coping mechanism. As financial stress mounted, cracks formed in their marriage. Serena blamed Damien for ignoring legal advice and accused him of weakness. Damien retaliated, claiming she pushed him into unnecessary expenses. Arguments erupted daily: shattered glass, slammed doors, silent treatments. Their social circle sensed turmoil. Invitations dwindled. Serena's once confident posture wilted into bitterness, while Damien's arrogance shifted to desperation. Nights were spent calculating expenses, searching for loopholes, attempting to hide financial collapse. Trust evaporated. Their marriage, once united by greed, now teetered under fear. The estate, meant to elevate their status, was slowly consuming their relationship, leaving resentment and panic in its wake. The situation worsened when a contractor filed a lawsuit for unpaid labor. Court documents arrived, and Damien's composure cracked. He assumed his wealth granted immunity, but the legal system didn't bend to arrogance. During the hearing, the judge reviewed financial statements and questioned the legitimacy of transactions. When the will was submitted as evidence, Clause 7 resurfaced, forcing the court to acknowledge potential ownership complications. The possibility of forfeiture jeopardized collateral used for loans, and creditors demanded immediate repayment. Lawyers circled like vultures, sensing vulnerability. Damien left the courthouse shaken, realizing his empire was built on fragile ground. The law, once ignored, had become his greatest threat. Following the court complication, the financial institution took precautionary measures, temporarily freezing estate accounts until inheritance legitimacy could be verified. Damien attempted to withdraw funds and was denied. Shocked, he contacted Serena, who reacted with fury and panic. Their lifestyle halted abruptly. Credit cards declined, renovations paused, and unpaid bills accumulated rapidly. Collectors began calling hourly. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with scandal. Without access to funds, Damien couldn't sustain his image of power. The estate, once his pride, now felt like a prison. The realization sank in: the will wasn't symbolic, it was binding, and his reckless decisions had activated its most devastating clause. News spread. Local media reported the lawsuit and hinted at financial instability. Neighbors whispered, friends gossiped, and social circles mocked their downfall. Online forums dissected the situation, painting Damien and Serena as greedy opportunists. The nursing home incident resurfaced, drawing outrage and sympathy toward Beatrice. People questioned how a son could abandon his elderly mother after receiving wealth. Invitations vanished, associations severed. Serena couldn't bear the humiliation and blamed Damien for ruining her reputation. Their once admired status collapsed, leaving them socially exiled. The backlash wasn't just financial, it was moral. The community delivered judgment before the courts did, and Damien realized he was despised, not envied. With assets frozen, lawsuits pending, and public opinion against them, Damien's facade shattered. Panic consumed him. Sleepless nights were spent reviewing the will, searching for loopholes. He contacted multiple attorneys. None could bypass Clause 7. Serena threatened to leave if he couldn't restore their wealth, adding emotional torment to financial desperation. Every call from creditors tightened the noose. For the first time, Damien understood the gravity of his betrayal. His arrogance had cost him everything: money, reputation, marriage, and stability. The thought of begging the mother he discarded terrified him. Yet deep down, he knew the inevitable: he would soon have no choice. The full collapse of Damien's reputation happened slowly, then all at once. Former business partners distanced themselves, refusing to associate with someone under legal scrutiny. Sponsors pulled out of deals, citing risk to their brands. Friends who once attended his lavish parties now ignored his calls. Parents at his children's school whispered behind his back, labeling him entitled and immoral. Local newspapers portrayed him as the man who abandoned his elderly mother for wealth, an image that spread quickly. Serena's social media was filled with criticizing comments, and she disabled her accounts in humiliation. Invitations ceased, endorsements halted, and his name became synonymous with greed. Damien felt the sting of isolation, realizing the luxury he flaunted was now poison. His kingdom of status crumbled, leaving him publicly disgraced. The financial wreckage placed unbearable strain on Damien and Serena. Their unity dissolved into shouting matches and accusations. Serena blamed him for ignoring the lawyer's warnings and mismanaging funds. She called him foolish, selfish, and incompetent. Damien countered, accusing her greed of fueling unnecessary expenses. Nights were filled with slammed doors and broken glass. The love they claimed was exposed as convenience. When Serena learned assets were frozen and creditors filed liens, she erupted, packing her designer clothes and threatening divorce. "I didn't marry a failure," she spat before storming out. Their alliance, built on wealth, crumbled under adversity. Without Serena's support, Damien felt abandoned. His greatest fear surfaced, losing everything and facing the consequences alone. For the first time, he wondered if pride had destroyed not only his fortune but his family. The lawsuits multiplied. Contractors sued for unpaid work, banks demanded repayment, and creditors filed claims. Damien spent days shuttling between courtrooms and law offices, drowning in legal jargon and mounting fees. Judges questioned his capability to maintain the property, given the frozen assets and Clause 7 implications. Opposing attorneys highlighted his negligence and reckless spending. The pressure intensified when Serena's abandonment became public knowledge, weakening his defense and credibility. Each hearing chipped away at whatever remained of his confidence. He once believed wealth granted immunity. Now he understood the law was indifferent to entitlement. With every lost motion and rising fee, the possibility of bankruptcy loomed. Damien felt trapped in a nightmare of his own making, slowly suffocating under the weight of legal ruin. The breaking point arrived when the court approved asset repossession. Luxury cars were towed from the driveway. Artwork and jewelry were inventoried for auction. Contractors reclaimed materials from unfinished renovations. Notices were posted on the estate gates, property under legal hold. Damien stood helpless as strangers cataloged belongings he once flaunted with pride. The mansion echoed with emptiness, no parties, no celebrations, only loss. He stared at the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, realizing symbols of success had turned into reminders of failure. Neighbors watched, whispering as his empire crumbled. The estate, once his sanctuary, became a monument to arrogance. And the final blow landed when the court declared he could lose everything if Clause 7 remained violated. Cornered, Damien faced the unthinkable. He had to beg help from the mother he discarded. His pride resisted, but desperation outweighed ego. With trembling hands, he drove to the nursing home he once shoved her into. Along the way, memories resurfaced: birthdays, school recitals, college graduation, moments she supported him unconditionally. Shame burned in his chest. When he entered, staff recognized him, their expressions cold. He asked to see her, voice cracking. The walk down the corridor felt like a march to judgment. He wasn't there out of love but necessity, a truth that twisted his gut. Damien knew this meeting could determine his future, and yet he feared facing the consequences of his cruelty. When he finally stood before Beatrice, the words stuck in his throat. She stared at him without anger, only exhaustion and sorrow. He attempted apologies, but they sounded hollow, forced. Eventually, desperation overcame hesitation. Damien admitted the inheritance was conditional, the estate at risk, and his financial ruin imminent. He begged, voice cracking, eyes wet, pleading for her to return home and restore the legitimacy of his ownership. The roles reversed. The son who once abandoned now sought salvation. But Beatrice, wounded by betrayal, didn't respond immediately. She needed to process whether helping him would heal or reopen devastating wounds. Damien felt helpless, knowing the decision rested solely in the hands of the woman he had cast aside. To salvage whatever remained, Damien staged a public apology. He invited media outlets and community leaders, hoping visibility would soften their perception. Cameras captured him delivering a tearful speech, acknowledging mistakes and expressing remorse for discarding his mother. Yet many doubted his sincerity, suspecting motives tied to legal benefits rather than genuine regret. Online reactions were divided, some sympathetic, others unforgiving. Beatrice watched from the nursing home, conflicted. The apology couldn't erase pain, but it signaled awareness, perhaps the first authentic crack in Damien's arrogance. Still, redemption was not guaranteed. Words were no longer enough. What he needed was transformation, and she held the final key. Hold on, hit the like button and subscribe right now. because the next part of this story turns the tables in a way no one saw coming. The final review of the will take place in a courtroom packed with spectators and reporters. Mr. Aldridge presented the original document, emphasizing Clause 7 and the clear violation of its terms. Damien's arguments fell apart under scrutiny. Evidence of his treatment of Beatrice, financial recklessness, and willful neglect undermined any defense. The judge ruled that the conditions were undeniably breached, triggering the clause. Gasps rippled across the room as it became official. The inheritance was no longer valid under Damien's control. The wealth he flaunted became inaccessible. His arrogance had finally collided with law, and there was no escape. The courtroom echoed with the weight of consequence. Karma had moved from speculation to reality. With Clause 7 activated, legal control shifted. The estate was transferred to a temporary trustee until compliance could be verified. Damien watched helplessly as documents he once signed with confidence now condemned him. Serena, present only to witness the outcome, recoiled at the news. The trustee acknowledged Beatrice's rights and well-being, confirming she was the intended beneficiary if Damien failed. Wealth no longer symbolized triumph. It became a reminder of lost integrity. The gavel's final strike severed Damien's illusion of dominance. The estate that once crowned him king now served as proof of his downfall. The transition wasn't just legal. It was symbolic, reclaiming honor for sacrifices he ignored. The official notice arrived days later. Banks, courts, and creditors were informed. Damien's authority over the estate was revoked. His accounts remained frozen. Luxury cars, jewelry, investments, everything slipped from his grasp. He was left with debt, lawsuits, and shame. The house he once renovated was no longer his to enter. Locks were changed, access denied. Neighbors saw him standing outside gates he once proudly opened. Reporters captured images of his defeat. Pride had transformed into humiliation. For the first time, Damien understood the depth of his betrayal, not as a concept, but as a lived consequence. Wealth built on cruelty had crumbled, leaving him stripped of status, respect, and pride. Serena's departure was swift. She refused to share responsibility for the fallout. When she realized the estate was lost, she filed for divorce, claiming emotional distress and financial deception. She packed whatever wasn't seized, designer clothes, jewelry, and personal items, and left without a backward glance. Her vows vanished as quickly as her loyalty. Damien begged her to stay, but she only saw a man without wealth or influence. Their marriage, founded on opportunism, collapsed under adversity. The person he once leaned on vanished, leaving him alone in a rented apartment, surrounded by debt notices. Serena's abandonment delivered the final blow. He had traded a mother's love for a partner's greed and lost both. While Damien faced collapse, Beatrice's life transformed. Mr. Aldridge informed her of the court's ruling, granting her authority to decide the estate's future. She returned to the nursing home, not as an abandoned resident, but as a woman reclaiming her dignity. Staff members greeted her with respect, aware of the injustice she endured. With arrangements finalized, she chose to leave the facility. As she walked out, sunlight warming her face, she felt freedom rather than escape. For the first time since Arthur's death, she breathed without fear. The world no longer saw her as a burden, but as a woman who survived betrayal with grace and resilience. Beatrice stepped into the estate with a trustee and legal representatives by her side. The mansion, once remodeled to erase her, now returned to her authority. She didn't seek revenge through destruction. Instead, she restored what mattered. She rehired loyal staff, protected heirlooms, and halted reckless renovations. She honored Arthur's legacy by safeguarding the home rather than exploiting it. Financial advisors ensured stability, while charitable provisions followed her values, not greed. Control wasn't about power, it was about justice. She reclaimed her narrative, proving that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it quietly rebuilds. Her dignity, once dismissed, became the foundation of a new beginning. Damien requested a final meeting, not for reconciliation but closure. Beatrice listened, not with resentment but clarity. She didn't return the estate or wealth. Forgiveness didn't erase consequences. She wished him well and encouraged him to rebuild his life with humility. The son who once commanded her was now humbled, learning lessons wealth never taught. Beatrice moved forward independently, financially secure, respected, and free. She traveled, engaged in charity, and surrounded herself with genuine relationships. Her story didn't end in bitterness, it ended in empowerment. Karma didn't destroy her, it restored her. And the world finally saw her not as a burden, but as a survivor who rose with grace.